We had some workshops here in South Africa with representatives, delegation from Cameroon. I've met with some of your compatriots in Washington, D.C. on more than one occasion. So I think I can say I have a little bit of understanding of what unfolded, particularly in the country since 2016, 2017. But I also read about the history, where it all came from, and the challenges that you have experienced over decades, not only in the last 9 years. So from our perspective as South Africans, we are deeply concerned about the situation. Firstly, about the fact that there's this ongoing contestation between the different ethnic communities, but also about the fact that there's no real democracy being practiced in Cameroon. And it's almost, in our view, as if it started to disappear in the last number of decades. So we as an organization called In Transformation Initiative does work around the world in conflict situations wherever we are being called upon to come and share the South African experience. And let me remind you, South Africa was at the brink of a civil war in the late 1980s. Those of you who were around at that stage already would recall that. Others would have read it in the history books. But we were really at the brink of civil war. And no one in the world, including ourselves, gave us a chance to overcome the threat of a serious, violent outbreak of a civil war. And somehow we survived that threat. We came through it with peaceful negotiations, dialogue and negotiations, and in the end, a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy. And I think that is the main feature of what we're going to talk about today. The reality is that it was not easy to get to that point. Apartheid was a terrible part of our history. But even up to the last moment, there were those on the minority white side of the community of the South African nation that thought it was possible to continue with apartheid almost indefinitely, and that they wanted to do it by means of brutal force, using military and police capacity and capabilities to uphold the control that existed for so long by the white minority. I was part of the apartheid government from 1986 onwards. I held different positions as deputy minister in the apartheid government before the change started to happen. I then continued in the government when the change became happening, when Mr. Mandela was released from prison, and I continued as part of the National Party government's, apartheid government's negotiating team from beginning to end. For the greater part of that time, I was the chief negotiator for the apartheid government. And it was in that period that Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, our current president, was the chief negotiator for the ANC. And the two of us had to take responsibility on behalf of our principals. Mr. Mandela on the one side, Mr. F.W. de Klerk on the other side. And the two of us had to negotiate or lead the teams to negotiate the peace. It was not always easy, as you will recall. It was sometimes backwards and forwards, 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. and sometimes there was no progress at all. But in the end, we succeeded. And we're going to talk, Mohammed and I are going to talk a little bit about that experience, how we succeeded. But before we come to the period of negotiations, I think it's important that we reflect also from our opposing positions, where we found ourselves during the 1980s, and what convinced people to say it's better to talk than to keep on fighting. Because I think that's the question that in every conflict situation one has to ask yourself. Are we going to carry on with the fighting, or are we going to find a different way of bringing about a transition from the conflict to a peaceful solution? And fortunately, like I said, in our case, we succeeded in doing that. During the 1980s, and particularly the last part of the 1980s, 1985 to 1990, it was the worst time of apartheid. It was a violent period in South African history. On the international side, pressure started to rise through various activities organized by the ANC internationally. They were very capable of organizing and mobilizing international support against apartheid. The slogan around the world was "Free Mandela." And some of you might have participated in those activities. The reality is that it was mobilizing that international support that brought about sanctions against the apartheid regime. It was a very comprehensive set of sanctions, from economic sanctions to sports sanctions, everything, arts and culture, you name it, it was in every space. The Springboks, our South African rugby team, as you know it now, couldn't play internationally. We were banned from playing any international game. Today we are the world champions. But and the point is, I just point out, it was not only economic sanction, it was in every space that we had the experience of being penalized. So that was on the one side. But on the other side, there was internal unrest that these guys, Mohammed and his comrades, were organizing because they wanted to make the country ungovernable. And they started to succeed in that. The security forces could not control the situation completely. And the more and more the governance of the country slipped away from the apartheid regime, despite the fact that we had a very competent defense force at that stage. It was not only the biggest and the best defense force on the continent, it was probably the 5th or the 6th best in the world at the time. And you will recall that we even had developed the nuclear capacity. So that was the background. And within that space, within the white community, we had to convince people to say, it's going to be better to find a negotiated solution. But the leader at that stage, P.W. Botha, who was the president of apartheid South Africa in that period, in fact for the whole of the 1980s, refused to release Mr. Mandela. He said yes for negotiations, but without Mandela. Now, that was just impossible and unthinkable. So it was a matter of raising the level of pressure, also from within the white community, to make people realize, to make our own party members realize, it's going to be better to negotiate than to keep on fighting. At the beginning, people like me who were arguing for change were in the minority. Personally, I said publicly in 1983 already, apartheid had to go. but those of us who said it at that stage were the minority. So it was a matter of arguing, debating, and convincing people from within inside. Otherwise, we would have never reached the point where we could say apartheid must go. And it is this phase of internal pressure, contestation also, that I think might be of interest to you. We had the typical situation of the hawks against the doves, the hardliners against those that argued that we had to look for a negotiated settlement. In the end, in 1989, P.W. Botha fell ill, and he had to step aside. And then came the new leader, F.W. de Klerk. And it was very significant that within 3 months after he was elected the new apartheid president, he was prepared to make the announcement to release Mr. Mandela from prison. I say it's significant because, as we all know, once leaders get to the position of the highest authority, they are reluctant to step aside. De Klerk knew very well what was going to happen if he releases Mr. Mandela. It would be the end of the white control of the country. And he thereby knew that he was actually announcing the end of his term, the day that he announced the release of Mr. Mandela, which he was prepared to do. And that was a significant moment for all of us in South Africa. That happened on the 11th of February 1990, and now the process of negotiations could start. But I just wanted to give you that background of where we were coming from. A period of terrible contestation, of people not thinking there's ever going to be a peaceful resolution to the South African apartheid conflict. And despite that, we succeeded in overcoming all the challenges. The next 6 years that followed, from 1990 to the conclusion of our negotiations on the final constitution, was also a period of deep contestation, but not, fortunately, that much violent. Except that we had violent competition suddenly, after the release of Mandela, between different political groupings inside the country. Because the ANC was now unbanned as from 1990. It could start to mobilize its own support base. But at the same time, there was the Inkatha Freedom Party of Buthelezi, who wanted to put up their own structures at the national level. And this contestation between the ANC and the IFP unfolded in a huge problem with regard to political violence that suddenly played out in the streets of Johannesburg, center Johannesburg, not here where we're sitting now, but in center part of Johannesburg. There was bloodshed, and suddenly there were people on the side of the apartheid security forces who were giving support, quietly, confidentially, secretly, to the IFP. And of course that raised new tensions at the political level between Mandela and de Klerk. Mandela all the time accused de Klerk of the fact that there was violence happening through the support of apartheid rogue structures. And it did happen. So even when we started with the negotiations, serious negotiations on the new constitution, this type of violence led to breakdowns in the negotiations. There was a moment, you might not recall the name, but there was a moment when there was a massacre just south from here in the southern part of Johannesburg called Boipatong. Now, Sharpeville was in 1962. But this moment in 1992, this Boipatong massacre that happened here, was directly related to the contestation between the ANC and the IFP and the support of rogue elements of the security forces. And it caused Mr. Mandela to call off all negotiations, an abrupt stop. And as from that moment, we had to start from scratch again, because we had to find a solid base for which, or on which, we could start the negotiations and look at each other and say, what is it that we want from the future? And maybe this was the defining moment in our whole process. And I want to share this with you because I was directly involved. Share it with you because I think it's something that could determine your own way of thinking. So here was the breakdown. It happened at the end of June 1992. Paipatong massacre forced Mr. Mandela to call off the negotiations. He made a public announcement and said no further talks with the National Party government because we can't trust them. Look what has happened, and they were responsible. I was then the chief negotiator already for the National Party, and you can imagine how I felt. My heart was in my shoes because it was like the end of the process. We all thought we were going to go back to the bush, so to speak. And the next moment my phone was ringing. And remember 1992, it was long before cell phones arrived. So it was my landline. And it was in the evening. I was alone at home. Phone rang. I picked up. And I heard the voice on the other side was Cyril Ramaphosa. And Ramaphosa said to me, hello. And my first reaction was, what the hell are you doing? Meaning, calling off the negotiations. And his first reaction was, when can we talk? So I immediately realized he phoned me with the authority of Mr. Mandela. Otherwise, he would not have called me. I went back to the clerk immediately and said, I had this call, can I talk? And he said, of course, yes. So the next day, we started to talk. Ramaphosa and I and a very close group on each side. Very, very small group. In fact, we were a total of 7 people. And for the next 3 months, we talked without stop. At the beginning, completely confidential, secret, nobody knew about it. But as time went on, we had to pull in other people responsible from both sides. And in the end, after 3 months, we had an agreement. And that agreement became known as the Record of Understanding. And in my mind, that agreement was the final settlement of the apartheid problem in South Africa. Because that is where we agreed on how to go forward. And during that period of 3 months, I can say it because I was the lead negotiator. During that period of 3 months, we had to ask ourselves the question, what is it that we want from the future instead of what is it that we want to protect from the past? And we succeeded in eradicating the past almost in our minds and focus on what it is. What is our vision for the future? And that shift brought about the agreement. Because I could go back to Cyril and say to him, this is our position. And we found out that we were on the same plate, on the same agenda. We could, from there on, work towards realizing an agreement which resulted in the new constitution for South Africa. Because our vision was comparable. It was not about what we had to protect from the past, but what we wanted from the future. And I emphasize this because I think that was really the moment that brought about the solution for us. So let me stop there just by saying, we recognize that South Africa and Cameroon are 2 different countries. each with its own problems and challenges. For us in the past, but some are still in our domain today. You all know it. South Africa is not an easy country. We still have our challenges. We still have a problem of poverty, of unemployment, and huge inequality. It's still there. But at least we have a political system, a democratic political system that is working. And Mohammed will tell you, there were challenges in the last 30 years within the ANC about keeping democracy going. And every time, democracy won. Through the constitution that we have, and the fact that that constitution is being protected by the Constitutional Court that was created. So that is the story. I give you just a broad overview of a timeline that we can take almost by the day for a period of 6 years during the negotiations. But I think I've tried to give you some of the reflections at the national level. Let me say something about my colleague. Mohammed and I fortunately became acquainted to each other after the big fight was sort of over. We became acquainted when we were both elected to the new Democratic Parliament in 1994. He was elected to the Senate, as it was then, and I was elected to the National Assembly. And we had to continue the work on drafting the final constitution, because Parliament then had the responsibility as a constitutional assembly to draft the final constitution. We had an interim constitution that resulted in the first democratic election and the election of President Mandela in 1994. But now the newly elected Democratic Parliament had the responsibility of drafting the final constitution. And so it was now our task from the side of all the parties that were elected to draft that constitution. And Mohammed and I became known to each other in that process, because he was part of the ANC. I was still part of the National Party at that stage. And I must say it was a wonderful experience to work together then in a far more, I would say, clinical way, to draft the best constitution in the world. Not so much looking at where we were opponents, but where can we work together in ensuring the best possible constitution for the country. That was after 1994. That is when we came to know each other. I didn't know him in his bad times, when he was an activist and a rebel and a protester and a troublemaker. And so I started to know him when him and I were together in Parliament. But since then, we started to realize there's a way for us to work together in exchanging to people like yourselves and in many conflict situations around the world what we went through in changing from apartheid to democracy, from autocracy to democracy, from dictatorship to democracy. Because those are the features of most conflicts around the world. And we could share it. Despite the fact that every country has its own unique problems, we could share the overall universal experience that we had. And that is what we're still doing. We established our little organization, which is called In Transformation Initiative, in 2013, working with other colleagues. And I'm amazed to see how many people from around the world are still reaching out to us. Because the South African case is being seen as a benchmark. Not perfect, but it's a benchmark of how people can actually come together and find common ground. And on that note, Mohammed and I were in the United States just last month for a 2-week trip at their request in Washington State doing a road trip at their request to share our experience with the focus on the question, how do you bridge the divide in polarized communities? And all that we did was talking like we're doing now with you, to communities around the United States. And it's amazing that people ask us, first of all, to do so, but secondly, that they're prepared to listen to us and giving us standing ovations when we talk about this. We couldn't believe it, but that is because of the highly polarized experiences that people are going through in the United States right now. Let me stop there and say thank you again for this opportunity.
Good morning. My name is Mohammed Baba, and I'm a lawyer by training. And difficult as it may be for you to believe, I was classified black. It's largely because I'm of Indian descent, 6th generation, or 5th generation, I think. The material deprivation that my family and my community suffered was nowhere near what African people and the indigenous people in this country suffered. But as a lawyer, we didn't have a choice. So any dreams of buying a Ferrari flew out of the window when we were asked to do certain things. So to say that the struggle was fought at various levels, my task was to represent my comrades who were charged in terms of the Terrorism Act and so forth. And then, of course, that was the formal. The informal stuff, I still haven't told Rolf what I used to do. So what made South Africa, in many ways, there are some lessons to be drawn from the South African instance as opposed to the other independence movements in Africa that Cameroon can, I think, draw from that, if I may. If you recall, in Africa, we were the last to become independent, so to speak. But there was a difference. The difference was we called it a decolonization of a special type. Largely, sorry, it was a decolonization of a special type. Largely because our enemy had no homeland to go back to. So in Rhodesia, in Zambia, in Mozambique, once Samora Machel came in, the Portuguese people left for Portugal. Where was Rolf and them going? Nowhere, because they had become pariahs in the world. And so whatever negotiated settlement we had to accommodate the fact that the new South Africa had to accommodate our oppressor. And that made it much more difficult. There was a second very important event that took place. When we sit with our youngsters now, they say we sold out. But here's the context. The context is that 1989 was a significant time that had a huge impact on us, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a multipolar world. We had the Soviet Union on one side and we had the US. We were supported by the USSR. Not all of us were communists, but America had a vested interest in apartheid until it became unsustainable for them and indefensible for them. Also, I think, to give you a context of where we are right now with all our problems, 30 years hence, I was asked, what do you think is the greatest achievement of our constitution and the country? And I said the notion of a state. And here is the issue. The system of apartheid was designed to elevate our ethnic impulses above the notion of a state. So it divided us in terms of Zulus, Xhosas, And it was a very clever way of dividing us and ruling us. They then gave the homelands, they developed the homelands and gave quasi-governance or authority to ethnic identity and ethnic leaders. It also propped up, through a very clever system, the traditional leaders. So there was a significant part of the black population, not the largest, but a significant part, who would have had an interest in apartheid continuing, because it was about material interest. And I say this because I think it is extremely important to perhaps draw from our experiences of how we were able to address that. Not only did we have an adversary in the white community, but we had vested interest in the black community as well for the continuation of apartheid. At the same time, the fall of the Berlin Wall said we had no more a sponsor. So basically you had two negotiating partners who were not negotiating from a position of strength. Both were negotiating from a position of weakness, neither capable of defeating the other. And the only result was going to be a civil war. But also in our minds at a personal level, Rolf's people were also victims of a genocide at the hands of the British. And we needed to understand, what is it that the people who are a victim of genocide, when they get into power, they do exactly the same thing. Sounds familiar in today's world as well, doesn't it? And so these were some of the things that we had to take into account. And we realized that what Rolf and them and the politicians and the architects of apartheid were peddling in fear. What they did was they took the trauma of a nation, politicized it and weaponized it. So we had to address the fear, which had to translate itself in the Constitution. We can leave it at an academic debate, but it had to translate into something where our enemy, who was driven by fear, whose genocide was politicized and weaponized, what is it that they could invest in that Constitution, and what would enable Rolf to go back to his constituency and tell this very scared minority that, you know what, put your toe in the water, yeah? This may be only a way out. So it was an easier way for Rolf and them to go back to their constituency, right, and address their fear, because that, Rolf will tell you, speaking to your own constituency is one of the most difficult things to do. And I can talk about that at an academic level, but think about it, that on the 25th of April 1994, our guys were still throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. But on the 2nd of May, when the results came out, we had to embrace that same policeman. At a practical level, it's very difficult. You're asking for a mindset. Rolf spoke about rugby. I mean, I'm an educated person. I'm in a privileged position. I'm part of the elites. But even in 1995, as a member of parliament, the South African, we had the Rugby World Cup here. It took a lot of emotional crossover for me to start supporting South Africa again. And mine is at a very academic level. Can you imagine the average person who suffered for so long to try and convince them? And I need to give you that, you know, the context of where we were. The other thing what we learned, and it's saddened to say this because we all belong to Africa. Some of our brothers in the independence movements north of us did exactly the same thing after independence. And we couldn't have gone that way. Because I remember Mandela's words to us was, if your fight is not value-driven, your fight has not been worth it, because you're just the same as your oppressor then. You're just looking for power. But if if our value system was not value-driven, how could Rolf and them go back to their constituency and say that, please, go with us on this one, your children would be safer? It had to be value-driven. Now again, it could be an academic exercise, but it had to be contained in the Constitution. Now, if I make an evaluation 30 years hence, I hope I'm not sounding immodest when I say this. You know, South Africans tend to be a bit arrogant sometimes because we sometimes think we're not in Africa. I'll admit that. Is when we look back, we've recalled 2 presidents in South Africa. And life is still going on. And that I'd like to give credit to Rolf and whoever was involved, that perhaps we got something here that's sustainable. I'm a member of the ANC, embarrassingly so, but we deserve it. We didn't get the 50%. Life still goes on. And perhaps there may be something in this Constitution that's helping us. So the first thing we had to do was to create the notion of a state. Go to the tribes, the 11 tribes, and tell them nobody is going to compromise the notion of a state. So you had to elevate your impulses into a patriotism into one country, South Africa, where regardless of what your tribe, remember we came from a system that was separating us on tribal instincts. So what is it that we had to do to create the notion of one South Africa, but at the same time not deprive yourself and feel excluded because of your ethnic identity? And that balance we had to strike. We would be naive. I'm Muslim. There's polygamy in my practices. There's a number of customary things that are anathema to a liberal democratic constitution. Now we could have stated there, we have equality of rights and no polygamy. It would be naive to do these things. So there are contradictions in the Constitution. That allows the Constitutional Court, as women will urbanize, become educated, they will challenge in the future, and it's happening already. I can tell you Muslim women are now going to go to court and say, now this Sharia thing about me getting 1/6 in a will, where does it come from? We're not living in Saudi Arabia. But it enables the Constitutional Court to measure the impulses and the mores of a nation. And it's a gradual thing. So we had to accommodate all these things, I thought. And when you ask me to do an evaluation, we've made lots of mistakes. But the one thing I'm particularly proud of is the fact that South Africa still exists. Of course, we've had problems. We've had a president previous to this one who pushed the ethnic impulses to get into power. But, yes, and embarrassingly so, I'm a member of the ANC, we allowed it to happen for 3, 4, 5 years. Too long. But you know what happened? It is exactly the Constitution and the institutions that protected our Constitution that saved us from him. And here's the irony, is we know we're African. Come on, guys, let's be honest about certain things. In the African and, I mean, I'm Muslim, I know in the Arab context, the fact that you have obscure tribes who don't have the numbers or the power for historical reasons, they will never emerge in democratic institutions or democratic elections. Guess what? Our president is from one of the most obscure tribes in South Africa. And I find that heartening to say that that happened. That we had a president that took advantage of the advantage of the numerical advantage, took control over the ANC, took control over the country, and immediately thereafter, we get a president who comes from the most obscure tribe. So while the ethnic impulses do emerge, and people will take, populism always exists, it's good to know that we may be just going over that slowly. But let me come back to, so I've spoken about the notion of a state. We have accountable institutions. But here's the important thing. What is it that Rolf and them, who had the best army in Africa, what is it that will we put in the constitution that will make them feel? There were certain things we were not prepared to negotiate. A qualified franchise, and democracy was a given. There was no way we're going to negotiate that. A society based on gender equality, that was not negotiable. Of course, that was a reflection of the dynamics within the ANC. Didn't necessarily. I mean, we have an abortion thing, which maybe 60–50% of our community won't accept it, but they accept it. I mean, in terms of their morality, they're not going to agree with it. But the point is, the Constitutional Court was supreme. And what we did was, one is we had a bottom-up approach, never top-down. So it wasn't a smoke-filled room where bottom-up, never top-down. So whenever Rolf and us negotiated, the ANC was very good in establishing structures. So Rolf will tell you, for 2 years, we didn't see our families. This is between 94 and 96. Between 1990 and 94, exactly the same thing happened. The negotiations took place, but we went down to the ground. And as a young activist, I learned one thing: never underestimate the intelligence of your people. They are maybe illiterate. Doesn't mean they lack wisdom. Can't be elitist. So we would go to a mama or a gogo or a mkulu and go there, and they would understand. You're talking to people who've suffered for 300 years, and you're asking them to be patient. But the fact that you went there and gave them the dignity and made them feel that they are part of this process, that is what sustains us, not necessarily what's in the concept. There's an ownership in it. And that is, if I were to share a lesson with you, if there is anything that you need to draw from us, is this particular point. Likewise, Rolf and them went down to their constituency, because the toughest job is to speak to your own constituency. You are talking to people who've been suffering and waiting for so many years, and Rolf and them have to speak to a people who are overcome with fear and fearing vindictiveness on our part. They've been told, his constituency been told, that we're savages. All we know is how to rape and pillage. I mean, that was the message. That's how you... Imagine Rolf and them having to go back to them and said, hey, hang on a sec. Whereas we had to do likewise. And it is because the second lesson we learned was, you can read all the speeches. We may have had differences, but we never demonized each other in the process itself. There were rules of conduct, right? Never an attack on Rolf personally, and never, ever, ever did we attack the process, right? But Rolf is much more qualified to talk about that, because he was more intrinsically involved in that. Was wherever we go in conflict areas, there's a hastiness and trying to get an outcome. But if you don't have a buy-in and an ownership in the process itself, you will never have a buy-in on the outcome. So Rolf will talk about, I hope he talks about the talks about talks, which took place about 2 years. But you needed a trust in the Independent Electoral Commission. You needed all these things. And the process of making decision-making, or rather decision-making, you had to have an ownership of that. And you had an agreement. Let me just end off by, because I can go on forever, but let me just make one more point. We had a lunatic fringe. We had some crazies. I don't blame them. There were many people we sent into exile whose only skill, they were soldiers. Many of them felt that the politicians were making decisions that made their sacrifices worthless. They were soldiers. That was a task. The second was, and likewise, Rolf had a lunatic fringe on his side. There was a military side, there was a right wing. And the key was, how do we silence these people? Not punish them, silence them. While we were talking, some of our guys got into a church and killed people. Embarrassing. But what kept us intact was, one, we didn't demonize each other. Secondly, we created a strong center. So the lesson I learned as a young activist as well was, your enemy is not homogeneous. Homogeneous, they're not one. You get a lunatic fringe in your enemy, you get reasonable people in your enemy. Rolf will tell you, as far back as 1988, the ANC had already identified Rolf as a person we can speak to. So it wasn't done in public. The value of back-channel discussions and the value of personal friendships rescued us. The incident that Rolf speaks about, when Cyril phoned him, our people were angry. For God's sake, we were angry. While we're talking to you, our people are getting massacred, and we blamed de Klerk. But it is largely because Cyril was able to phone Rolf, and there was a personal trust that was developed there, that they were able to, away from the public eye. So one of the things we did was identify people who we can talk to and see what we have more in common than rather the differences, and we start building on that. And then last thing I'd like to say, we opened with a prayer. The politicians played their role, but in my view, if it wasn't for the likes of Archbishop Tutu and them, the faith-based organizations and civil society defined the perimeters of our morality and the morality of the politicians' conduct. And that really assisted us in creating that strong center. It's funny how human beings behave. Rolf will tell you, we laugh about it. The minute you put a television camera in this room, a person will be very careful what they say, because outside they'll be perceived in a particular way. So the discussions that took place were transparent. Yes, the side and back channel stuff we did quietly. But when it came to the main issues, I think the television camera saved us, because even the maddest of guys won't say certain things on TV because they also go to church. And their families go to church. So the conduct was defined by civil society, and particularly Reverend Frank Chikane, all of them, defined how we conduct ourselves, of course together with great leadership. So I thought, let me just titillate your curiosity with that, and then we can have a discussion on that, okay, if you don't mind.